God has never told us to be ignorant of the things that are going on in this world. And I think sometimes that might be a pitfall that we could find ourselves in, that we are so uninformed by the things that are taking place in our society that we have no clue what's going on in our world. And God never told us that at all, but he did tell us not to be consumed by it. And unfortunately, I think for a lot of people, Christian or not, that is the pitfall. Welcome back to the Sunday to Society podcast. I'm your host, Riley, where we help you go from the pews to the public square. We release new episodes every Monday on your favorite podcasting apps, such as Apple Podcast, Spotify, Amazon Music, and wherever else you listen to audio podcasts. You can listen to the video version of this podcast on YouTube. And if you haven't already, I encourage you to hit that subscribe button if you're watching on YouTube, or if you're listening to the audio version, hit that follow button wherever possible, and that helps us get the podcast out to even more people. I want to make a little bit of a follow-up episode today to the things that are going on in the Middle East, and we'll discuss those in more detail today, like we did last week. And I want us to maybe hit a little bit of a different angle when it comes to some of these things, because now that things have developed there a little bit over the last week, we are now beginning to see some of the effects from things that are taking place in that part of the world. And we mentioned that last week, but the chances are probably pretty good that you have some point today or yesterday checked your phone to see what might be taking place in the Middle East, specifically in Iran. And I don't know if you've gone to fill up your car with gas here recently, but the prices of gas have gone up here significantly just in the last week. Not only that, but also the stock market as well has been doing all kinds of crazy things. And here we are somewhere in the middle of that, trying to live our normal life. And we might even be acting like things are totally fine. But deep down inside, we really have this anxiety that might be attempting to overtake our lives, because we have no idea how this thing is going to continue to play out over the next couple of weeks, months, and maybe even years. We're not really sure, but here just in the last week, things have already begun to affect our normal everyday life. And so maybe you yourself have dealt with anxiety in some form or fashion, and now as these things begin to creep into our everyday life, you might see a increase in anxiety in your own everyday life. So let's jump into the episode today of the Middle East war, rising prices, and Christian anxiety. What does God have to say about this? Let's first discuss that it's a lot closer than we might initially have thought. And you might have initially thought to yourself just a couple of days ago, well, I'm not in Israel, I'm not in Iran, I'm not in the Middle East. How does this have any effect on my life at all? And I think we've already seen that it very much does have an impact in our life, even though the conflict is on the other side of the world. As I mentioned just a moment ago, if you've gone to fill up your gas tank in your vehicle over the last couple of days, you've probably realized that gas has gone up significantly. Not only that, but here there are travelers who are going through airports who are also now being affected, not necessarily by that, but on the downstream effects from that. There's shipping lines that have now been disrupted. And all of that is going to trickle into your wallet in some form or fashion. I mean, you think if gas has gone up, that means food prices are about to go up. And when you think of all of those different things, it's easy to get sidetracked and have anxiety creep in. And so here are all of these trickle down effects, and we're going to start beginning to feel it a lot more here real soon. And so you think now it's not just something that's going on the other part of the world, but it's going to be something that's going to affect my everyday life. And that's when the anxiety begins to creep in. And I'll turn to somebody like Elijah, who experienced a great victory for God, but then in the next chapter in First Kings began to have this anxiety and told God that it would be just better for God to kill him and to pick somebody else. Now, as we continue to think about how this has affected us in our everyday life, think about all of the Christians that are in that part of the world. There's plenty of Christians in Israel, there's Christians in Iran, and many other Middle Eastern countries, and think how this has affected their lives even more than it is maybe affecting my life and your life here in the Western part of the world or even in some other places. But think about how it's affecting everybody. It's not just affecting politicians, it's not just affecting soldiers in that part of the world, but it's affecting everyday people like you and me. Because of the uncertainty that we might be experiencing, that it really begins to place a burden on our own life. And this anxiety begins to creep in. And whether we're beginning to pay attention to it more or not, it's affecting us whether we like it or not. You see, nobody asked if we were ready for this, did they? I mean, how do you even begin to prepare for a conflict like this? I mean, it is the Middle East after all, and it seems like every other month there is some form of conflict taking place in that part of the world. However, this time it seemed a little different. This time it's affecting us a whole lot more than the times before. And I think that might be why part of this anxiety begins to creep into our own life. And really, rather than being focused on what's taking place there, we should be focused on what's taking place on the throne in heaven. And we discussed more about that last week. So if you haven't listened to last week's episode, I encourage you to go back into listen to that episode. But here I want to answer some question as to why we might be feeling so anxious, especially in this time of life and really this time in history. Because whether we've, again, are directly affected by it or not, there's this heightened sense of anxiety because of the uncertainty surrounding this whole entire conflict. And of course, not only the United States or Israel or Iran, but I'm sure many, many other countries have been asking the question, how much longer is this going to go on? And where does this affect our own everyday life? So I want us to spend the next couple of minutes in discussing some of the anxieties that are contributing to why we might be experiencing anxieties in our own everyday life. And the first, I think, is the most obvious and it's the most prevalent, and it is that of the financial anxiety. Now, maybe you're somebody who has experienced financial anxiety far before we even found ourselves in this type of conflict. And there could be a variety of reasons as to why you might be experiencing that. Maybe it's a debt that is coming due. Maybe here in the US, taxes are getting ready to be due in the next month. So maybe it's something that related. There could, I assume, be all kinds of different reasons as to why you might be feeling that type of anxiety. But especially with the conflict that's taking place now, we're seeing this in financial anxiety because of the stock markets, because of the gas, because of the inflation. Here real soon, it's going to be because of the grocery prices. And those things are going to be weighing on us financially. And maybe you're a person who is more prone to feeling financial anxiety for one reason or another. Now, let me draw your attention to God's word. Did God not say in the Sermon on the Mount that he would supply our everyday needs, like food, like shelter, and like clothing? So if God promised that he was going to meet our needs financially, he's going to meet our needs in the things that we need to sustain life, why should we be anxious about those things? Now, don't get me wrong. That's a human, normal response to feel anxiety about these things that are taking place. And especially when it begins to affect our wallet more than it did even last week or 2 weeks ago. Let me put it into perspective. I live in a state where we have a heavy tax on gasoline. But in the last, I would say, month, gas prices have jumped almost an entire dollar per gallon. And I'll be honest, that begins to hurt our wallet a little bit more than it did just even a month ago, especially if you drive long distance for work or if you're somebody who drives regularly. And if you have a vehicle that isn't necessarily the most economical with its gas mileage, you really begin to feel that strain. I think when we experience anxiety in that, that is very normal. It's a very normal human response. And again, as I mentioned just a moment ago, that our food prices are going to be going up because of the influx of gas prices. So there's then financial anxiety that we might begin to face, but there might also be a political anxiety. And there could be all kinds of reasons for that. Maybe it feels like you're unheard. Maybe it feels like you're unrepresented because maybe you yourself weren't particularly a fan of who's in power in government or the decisions that they've recently made. And you begin to feel this political anxiety. Now, who is the one who sets up kings and tears kings down? We talked about that last week. It's God, isn't it? He's the one who sets kings up, and he's the one who brings kings down. And do you think that this conflict took God by surprise? Not at all. We think that things like this take God by surprise, but know that God knew all about this long before it ever happened. That God knew that these particular events were going to take place. And regardless of where you fall on the political spectrum, there could be this political anxiety from either side of the aisle, right or left. However, do we allow that to creep into our life and affect our normal everyday life? But more importantly, do we allow that to affect our walk with God? I'm sure that you know people who make politics their entire identity. Maybe they will turn on a specific news broadcasting station and leave it on all day long. Or maybe they will listen to talk radio all day long. And they allow this to become their entire identity. So when things happen like this, they might begin to feel this political anxiety. There's also this existential anxiety, and this might be for more people who deal with fear than other people. And the fact that they're asking this question, is this the beginning of World War III? Is this the end of the world? And so on and so forth. Last week I mentioned that my Facebook feed has been so flooded with people who come up with all of these predictions and these prophecies that are found in the Bible. And I don't think that's where our focus should be. We talked about that last week, but we allow this existential anxiety in asking questions such as, is this World War III? Is this the beginning of the end? And so on and so forth, that we get our focus more on those types of things rather than having our focus on God. Because let's be honest, it's easy to get our focus on these types of questions. And it reminds me of the verse that's found in 2 Timothy chapter 1, where Paul tells a young Timothy, for God hath not given us the spirit of fear. Well, if Paul says that it hasn't come from God, then where does it come from? The very obvious answer is this. It comes from Satan himself. So we might be dealing with existential anxiety. We might also be dealing with spiritual anxiety. And by asking the question of, where is God in all of this? Where is God when he's allowing somebody like the nation of Israel to be bombed, or he's allowing Christians in Iran to maybe be killed because of the location where they live? And we might be asking the question, where is God in all of this? And there's this spiritual anxiety that begins to take place, get rooted into our own life. And I'll be honest, this is a valid question. How could a good God allow things like this to take place around the world? Forget the Middle East, but any other part of the world. How could a good God allow that? And where is he at in all of this? Well, the obvious answer to that is God is right there the entire time, isn't he? You see, Scripture teaches that God is omnipresent, meaning he's everywhere at once. So God is right there in all of this. God is right there, and he sees all of these things. And again, it didn't take him by surprise when the first shots, the first missiles, all of these things were let off. He knew all about it. But here's really the root of the entire problem. And maybe you're someone who feels anxious on one of these different things that we just mentioned, or maybe it's one of the other things. Here's the deeper problem at hand. The deeper problem, and part of the reason why we have this anxiety, is because we've placed our sense in security in systems that were never designed to hold it. Now, what do I mean by that? When we place our sense of security in finances, in political figures, in existential events that take place around the world, those were never designed by God to hold our security. So if they weren't designed to hold our security, I think then we have to ask the question, well, then what was? The most obvious answer is our sense of security should be found in God and in God alone. Why? God said that I will never leave thee nor forsake thee. God said that I will hold thy right hand. God knows all about this. And when we've placed our sense of security in these types of systems that were never designed to hold it, we are setting ourselves up for failure because they're going to let us down. So if we're going to talk about anxiety, as we already have, let's get a little bit of basis biblically on what the Bible actually says about anxiety. And the first verse that I want us to look at is Philippians 4, verse 6 and 7, which says, "Be careful for nothing, but in everything by prayer and supplication with thanksgiving, let your requests be made known unto God. And the peace of God, which passeth all understanding, shall keep your hearts and minds through Christ Jesus." What does that phrase, passeth all understanding, mean to the Apostle Paul as he writes this? Now, if you have studied the book of Philippians, you know that Philippians was written from jail. Best case scenario, he was on house arrest. But yet here's somebody who says that the peace of God, which passeth all understanding. It doesn't make sense, but it does to God. That's the point. You see, when we put our trust in a system that wasn't designed to hold it, like military power, economics, or government, of course we're going to be let down. Of course we're going to be let down when things don't go our way or things happen where we don't fully understand it. Yet when we put our trust in God, he won't let us down. Now, of course, putting our faith and trust in God, we might not always understand it, and that's okay. And we'll talk about that more here in just a moment. But I want us to look at Isaiah 26, verse 3, which says, "Thou wilt keep him in perfect peace, whose mind is stayed on thee, because he trusteth in thee." Let me ask you a question. What is the opposite of fear? The opposite of fear is peace. And here Isaiah is writing and saying that God will keep us in perfect peace, whose mind is stayed on thee, because he trusteth in thee. You know, I think if we trust God more, we'll probably have less anxiety in our life. This probably will be a less of a battle in our lives if we put our trust in God more. And I think if we're all honest with ourselves, we could all say that we really could use more trust in God, that we could trust God more. Because a strayed mind, a mind that gets wandered off on things like current events and maybe things that are going on in the Middle East or whatever it could be, is a mind that isn't anchored in God. A mind that is anchored in God will have peace. And let's be honest, there are plenty of people in our world today that long for peace in their life. And for the Christian, we have the key to peace, but unfortunately, many times we don't choose peace in our own life. We choose anxiety over peace because we are so absorbed by the things that are taking place in our world rather than being absorbed by the things that God has promised us in his word. Now, here's the thing. God has never told us to be ignorant of the things that are going on in this world. And I think sometimes that might be a pitfall that we could find ourselves in, that we are so uninformed by the things that are taking place in our society that we have no clue what's going on in our world. And God never told us that at all, but he did tell us not to be consumed by it. And unfortunately, I think for a lot of people, Christian or not, that is the pitfall. The pitfall of being so absorbed by the things and being so consumed by the things that are taking place in our lives that we're less consumed on God. That's where our focus should be on, shouldn't it? See, here, the challenge is this. Most of us scroll until we are sick of hearing of the same thing over and over and over again. We will scroll until we're sick, not until we're informed. And there is a difference in that, because we might just keep scrolling until we hear the same thing over and over and over and over again. And I'll be honest, when you hear the same thing over and over again, that begins to do a number on you. That begins to do something in your life that you are then consumed by it. Think about this. If we read the same verse, maybe Philippians chapter 4, like we just talked about, over and over and over again, I think then we might be consumed by that. I think then we might be consumed by that verse rather than what we are scrolling and seeing on social media or news websites or TV stations. And as we continue in our episode here, I want us to look at the idea that you don't have to have it all together. You know, it's okay to not have all the answers. It's okay not to know what's going to happen. It's okay that maybe somebody this week read the headlines and they don't have a theological answer for it. They might have some anxiety creeping into their thought process or to their mind or to their heart. And that's okay. It's okay to not have all of those answers, and it's okay not to have that all together. But I think what we do with that really speaks volumes as to where our trust is. Because if our trust is actually in political systems, in the economy, and military power, we're setting ourselves up for failure. But if our trust is in God, I think that's where we can then begin to find true, lasting peace. Because maybe you yourself either have somebody in your family or know somebody who is in the military and deployed, or maybe you have family abroad, or finances are already stretched a little thin before this conflict began, and that now that things are beginning to take place, things are getting even thinner. And that's not all hypothetical at all. Those are real life scenarios. And it is totally normal to feel anxiety as we think about these things. But when we turn our attention to the Bible, and in Matthew 11, verse 28, Christ says, "Come unto me, all that labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest." If you're experiencing anxiety, and if you are experiencing anxiety based on all of the things that are taking place around our world today, what do you do with it? Do you take it to the Lord like Christ asked you to here in Matthew chapter 11? You see, when we take our burdens to the Lord and we place them on him, Christ says, "I will give you rest." You know what Christ doesn't say here? He doesn't say, "Come to me once you've got it all figured out." And come to me, but what he does say is, "Come to me as you are, heavy and everything else that you might be dealing with, and I will give you rest." Let's be honest. We probably all use some rest in our life. We can probably use a little less anxiety in our life. We can use a little more less stress in our life. But what we do with that stress, with that anxiety, truly reveals who we are putting our faith and trust in. You see, if we take these issues, we take these anxieties to the Lord, he says, I will give you rest. It reminds me of Pilgrim in the book Pilgrim's Progress. If you'll remember, Pilgrim has this big burden that he's trying to get rid of. And I don't know if you've ever gone hiking, and especially if you're going for an overnight trip, you pack up this big heavy backpack with all of the different things that you might need for the trip. And that backpack could be 40, 50, 60, 70, 80 pounds. And no doubt that that backpack is very heavy. But in Pilgrim's Progress, he has this burden that he carries around with him. Later on in the book, Pilgrim eventually takes this burden that he's carrying and he lays it down at the cross. He doesn't pick it back up. Unfortunately, many Christians will pick it back up. But Pilgrim, in Pilgrim's Progress, doesn't pick it back up. Instead, he leaves it there. And imagine the weight that he was once carrying around is no longer on his shoulders. Instead, it's placed at the feet of Jesus. And that's exactly what Christ is asking for us to do here in Matthew chapter 11. Peter writes in 1 Peter 5 verse 7, casting all your care upon him, for he careth for you. You know what's interesting about this? And when I think of this verse, I think of somebody casting a fishing line out into a body of water when they're trying to catch fish. But this word casting is something that we have to do over and over and over again, not once. And if you've gone fishing, you know that sometimes you have to reel the line back in and then cast it back out. You don't just cast the line out and then let it sit there. You have to do it over and over and over again. And here's the thing, you don't have to fix the Middle East. You don't have to have all the answers. You don't have to have an opinion on every single airstrike that happens. You only have to trust God. Let's be honest, God knows exactly what he's doing. He knows exactly the decisions that leaders are going to make on all sides. He knows exactly how this is going to play out. So we just have to trust God. We have to allow God to, quite frankly, be God. We have to trust him. We have to cast all of our cares on him. We have to allow God to work in our own life so that we aren't so riddled with anxiety and fear and stress because of what is taking place, but instead we should put our trust in God. And let's be honest, something like this that is taking place in the Middle East should be a reminder to us that there is a bigger God out there, that there's a God who isn't taken by surprise in this, that there's a God who knows exactly what is going to happen and what is going to take place. Therefore, we should trust God in all of this rather than being focused on how is this going to play out? How is this going to affect me financially? How is this going to affect my family? And so on and so forth. And again, it's okay not to have all the answers right away, but we should be trusting God for who he is. Now, here you are. You're probably going to check your phone after this episode if you haven't already checked it while this episode is playing. What is going on in the Middle East? And something that you have no control over. By the way, don't worry and stress about something that you have zero control over. You know why? Because you are going to constantly be worrying about that over and over and over again. And when you can't affect the outcome, why even worry and stress about it and have anxiety about it? Again, let's look back at Philippians 4, verse 7. It says, and the peace of God, which passeth all understanding, shall keep your hearts and minds through Christ Jesus. Let the peace of God rule in your heart. And that is done by casting all of our cares on him, like we mentioned just a moment ago. It's okay that we don't have all the answers. It's okay that we might not always understand. Know that there is a God in heaven who promised to, number one, take care of our needs, promised that he is omnipresent, that he knows what's going on, and he's everywhere at once. So let the peace of God rule in your hearts rather than allow our circumstances in our life or around the world control our anxiety. Because Satan would love nothing more for us to be focused on the things that are going on around the world rather than being focused on what God is doing and that God is in control this entire time. If you haven't already, I encourage you to hit that subscribe button if you're watching on YouTube, or if you're listening to the audio version, hit that follow button. You can follow us on social media at Sunday to Society on Instagram, and you can like us on our Facebook page at Sunday to Society Podcast. I hope you have a great day, and God bless.